You know, when you look at a really majestic, sprawling old house, your eyes are just naturally drawn to the facade.
Right, yeah. You notice the grand columns, the fresh paint.
Exactly. The beautiful, ornate windows. And if you happen to notice a jagged crack running up the side of the brickwork, your immediate instinct is usually to look for a simple, surface-level explanation.
You blame a harsh winter or maybe a severe storm.
Yeah, or just, a bad batch of mortar or something.
It is the most natural human tendency. I mean, we are totally conditioned to look at the visible damage and just assume a localized, immediate cause. We treat the symptom rather than interrogating the actual system.
Right, but if you were to actually bring in a structural engineer, they wouldn't waste their time looking at the crack in the paint.
No, absolutely not. They would go straight down to the basement.
Right, they would examine the foundation, they would test the soil, and they would inevitably tell you that the house isn't cracking because of the wind or the rain. It's cracking because it was built directly on top of a massive geological fault line.
The pressure hasn't just been building for one season. It has been building up underground for a century.
Exactly. The structural integrity was compromised from the moment the very first stone was laid. The crack is just the earth finally demanding a reckoning.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it.
Well, welcome to another deep dive. Today, for you listening, we are not looking at the facade of a house. We are looking at the foundational fault lines of an entire nation.
We really are.
We are unpacking this massive, incredibly detailed stack of historical notes on the Nicaraguan Revolution. And, I mean, this is just a staggering story of foreign intervention, of almost unimaginable corporate and dictatorial greed.
And of a country fighting desperately, generation after generation, to reclaim its own destiny.
Yeah. We're looking at a history so volatile, involving, Marxist Sandinista revolutionaries and U.S.-backed Contra paramilitaries, that the debates around it are still fiercely partisan today.
They absolutely are.
And just to be absolutely clear up front, for you listening, our goal today isn't to take a political side or endorse any of these ideologies at all.
No, not at all. History at this level of complexity really defies simple categorization.
Right. We are here strictly to act as your guides through the raw historical notes, unpacking the absolute anatomy of a revolution impartially. No judgment, just looking at how things happened.
Because our objective is synthesis and understanding. We need to dissect how a nation transforms from a peripheral colonial outpost into the absolute epicenter of a brutal, one-defining, Cold War proxy conflict.
Yeah.
We have to explore how extreme wealth inequality, catastrophic natural disasters, and, well, relentless foreign meddling created this perfect, terrifying storm for rebellion.
Because the cinematic elements of the story are genuinely astonishing. I mean, we're going to encounter an American mercenary who casually attempts to conquer a sovereign nation and reinstate slavery.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. And we are going to examine a dictator who essentially ran an entire country's economy like he was the head of an organized crime syndicate.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at a leader fleeing a successful popular revolution in a private jet, bringing with him a backhoe and his father's exhumed corpse.
It carries the texture of magical realism, honestly, but it is entirely rooted in the brutal realities of geopolitics and economics.
So to understand how Nicaragua reached that boiling point in 1979, we really have to travel back and look at the physical terrain itself, right?
We do. Geography, in many ways, dictated Nicaragua's destiny from the very beginning.
So let's start with the Spanish era, looking at the period before independence in 1838, because the Spanish Empire had a very specific, ruthless checklist when they arrived in the Americas. They wanted precious metals.
They were chasing the El Dorado dream.
Right, but the reality on the ground in Nicaragua was entirely different, wasn't it?
It was. There were no immediate, massive deposits of gold or silver easily accessible to the conquistadors there.
Oh,
yeah. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they found a land that totally lacked those obvious immediate sources of immense wealth that you'd see in places like Mexico or Peru.
so what happens then?
Well, because of that, the Spanish crown largely neglected Nicaragua in terms of structural development or heavy investment. It just became a peripheral province to the Captaincy General of Guatemala.
And what happens to a colony when the empire doesn't see a shiny, immediate return on investment?
It becomes an extractive afterthought. Worse, actually. The Spanish authorities essentially stripped the land of its most valuable resource at the time, which was human labor.
Right.
They aggressively enslaved the indigenous population of Nicaragua, exporting tens of thousands of them to work in the silver mines of Peru or the plantations of the Caribbean islands.
That is just devastating.
It decimated the local population and left Nicaragua as a severely under-resourced, depopulated colony.
But they did establish a functional economy eventually, right? It was
Yeah.
just a very fragile, incredibly specific one based on a rather unusual commodity.
Right. They developed a subsistence agricultural economy, augmented by cattle ranching on the expansive plains, and a very specialized export market in what were called dye stuffs.
Dye stuffs, like for clothes.
Exactly. Before the chemical revolution, if you wanted brightly colored fabrics in Europe, the deep blues and vibrant reds favored by royalty and the wealthy, you needed natural plant and insect extracts.
So Nicaragua became the source for that.
Yeah, they became a major producer of indigo, which is a plant that produces a rich blue dye, and cochineal, a crimson dye derived from insects that live on cacti.
So for hundreds of years, the Nicaraguan elites are growing these dye plants, and Spain is providing a guaranteed captive market.
A closed loop, essentially.
Well, right. It's not creating untold riches, but it provides a stable, predictable income for the landowning class.
But that stability vanishes the exact moment Nicaragua achieves independence in 1838.
Because they break away from Spain, briefly attempt to form a united Central American republic, and then emerge as a completely independent, sovereign nation.
And suddenly, they are thrust into the chaotic reality of the global free market. They no longer have Spain guaranteeing the purchase of their indigo.
And the timing of this independence is almost cosmically unlucky.
It really is.
Because right as they're trying to stand on their own 2 feet economically, the Industrial Revolution is fundamentally altering the world over in Europe.
The scientific advancements of the mid-19th century just pull the rug out from under the Nicaraguan economy. In the 1850s, a British chemist named William Henry Perkin accidentally discovers how to create a synthetic purple dye aniline from coal tar.
Oh, no.
Yeah. This triggers a massive chemical revolution in Europe. Suddenly, factories in Germany and Britain can produce vast quantities of cheap, vibrant synthetic dyes in a laboratory.
Making the painstaking process of harvesting indigo plants and crushing cochineal insects in Central America completely obsolete overnight.
The global market for natural dyestuffs absolutely collapses. Nicaragua enters its crucial formative decades as an independent nation with its primary source of foreign revenue totally wiped out. They are facing an existential economic crisis.
And this economic desperation creates a massive, violent internal fracture, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because the elites of the country realize that if the export market is dead, the only remaining source of wealth and power is the state treasury itself. You have to control the government to survive.
Exactly. And this struggle splits the Pacific side of the country into 2 deeply hostile warring camps based in 2 rival cities, Leon and Granada.
So it's literally like 2 heirs fighting over a bankrupt family estate.
That is exactly what it was like. The divide between Leon and Granada wasn't just geographic, it was a profound ideological and economic schism. Leon, located to the north, became the stronghold of the liberals.
And in the 19th century Latin American context, liberal meant something very specific, didn't it?
Yes, very specific. They were fiercely anti-clerical. They wanted to secularize the state, strip the Catholic Church of its vast land holdings and its control over education, and aggressively commercialize agriculture to integrate into global markets.
They wanted to drag the country into modernity, essentially.
Through aggressive, often disruptive means, yes. Granada, on the other hand, situated on the shores of Lake Nicaragua to the south, was the bastion of the conservatives.
And they were the complete opposite.
Right. The conservatives represented the traditional aristocratic landholding class. They relied heavily on cattle ranching and deeply valued social hierarchy. Crucially, they viewed the Catholic Church as an essential, foundational institution necessary for maintaining social order.
So they thought if you mess with the church, you mess with the whole society.
They believed that if you attacked the church, as the liberals wanted to do, you would inevitably trigger a peasant uprising and destroy the fabric of society.
So you have the liberals in Leon wanting to tear down the old system to build a commercialized future, and the conservatives in Granada wanting to protect the traditional hierarchical order.
Yeah.
And because the national economy is essentially bankrupt, this philosophical debate plays out on the battlefield.
It devolves into a relentless cycle of civil war. If the conservatives controlled Managua, the capital, they would pass laws to disenfranchise the liberals and siphon the meager state revenues into their own pockets.
And then the liberals would rebel?
The liberals would then launch a military revolt, overthrow the conservatives, and do the exact same thing in reverse. It was a zero-sum game of survival disguised as political philosophy.
Now, while the Pacific coast is tearing itself apart in this cycle of civil war, the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, the eastern half of the country, is experiencing a totally different, entirely bizarre reality.
Very bizarre.
The sources refer to it as the Mosquito Coast, named after the indigenous Mosquito people. And the British Empire had established a massive, highly lucrative foothold there through a staggering piece of legal fiction.
The British approach to the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua was a masterpiece of imperial opportunism. The terrain over there is dense, impenetrable tropical rainforest, totally cut off from the Pacific cities of Leon and Grenada by a massive mountain range.
So the Nicaraguan government essentially had no physical presence or authority there at all.
Right. And the British recognized this vacuum.
But they didn't just invade and plant a flag, did they? They engineered a proxy state.
They utilized the indigenous mosquito population to create a geopolitical shield. The British took a local mosquito leader, transported him to the British colony of Jamaica, and formally crowned him the king of the Mosquito Coast.
You're kidding.
No, I'm serious.
Yeah.
They then declared that the British Empire was establishing a formal protectorate over this newly minted, supposedly independent indigenous kingdom.
So it's just an elaborate theatrical production designed entirely to steal timber.
That's exactly it. The primary motivation was the extraction of incredibly valuable hardwoods, specifically mahogany, which was in enormous demand in Europe for luxury furniture making. Well, by recognizing the fictitious Mosquito Kingdom, the British could sign logging treaties with their puppet king, completely ignoring the sovereign claims of the Nicaraguan government in Managua.
And the Nicaraguan elites couldn't do anything about it.
They were far too weak, too bankrupt, and too distracted by shooting each other to do anything about the British systematically logging the eastern half of their territory.
You have this fascinating, tragic dynamic. A poor nation fighting a brutal civil war over scraps, while the world's preeminent superpower quietly loots their backyard.
Yeah, it's brutal.
But Nicaragua had one inherent, undeniable geographic asset that would soon draw the attention of a rising power even closer to home. They possessed the ultimate geographic shortcut.
They possessed the San Juan River and Lake Nicaragua.
Right, because if we look at a map from the 1840s, we have to forget everything we know about the Panama Canal.
Absolutely. Back then, Panama was considered a nightmare, just a wall of solid rock and lethal jungle. Nicaragua, on the other hand, looked like it was custom designed by nature to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans.
How so? Like, what was the geography actually like?
The topography is remarkably convenient. The San Juan River flows directly from the Caribbean Sea into Lake Nicaragua, which is a massive deep-water inland sea.
Okay.
From the western edge of Lake Nicaragua, it is only a tiny, narrow strip of land, about 12 miles wide, that separates the lake from the Pacific Ocean.
Just 12 miles.
Just 12 miles. Engineers from all over the world looked at that 12-mile strip and realized that building a canal across Nicaragua would require vastly less digging and far less capital than attempting to blast through the Panamanian Isthmus.
And this geographical quirk becomes geopolitically explosive in 1849 because of a massive discovery thousands of miles to the north. Gold is discovered in California.
The California gold rush fundamentally alters the logistical demands of the United States. Suddenly you have tens of thousands of prospectors, businessmen, and settlers on the east coast of the United States who desperately need to get to San Francisco.
And their options for getting there are horrific, right?
Oh, terrible.
Like, if you are a young prospector in New York in 1849, you can join a wagon train across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, which takes months and carries a massive risk of dying from cholera, starvation, or exposure.
Right. Or you can book passage on a clipper ship, sail all the way down the entire length of South America, brave the lethal freezing storms of Cape Horn, and sail all the way back up the Pacific coast.
Which also takes months and is incredibly dangerous.
The demand for a faster, safer route was immense. And where there is immense logistical demand, there is immense profit to be made. Enter Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt. One of the most ruthless, brilliant, and wealthy tycoons in American history. He looks at a map, traces his finger up the San Juan River into Lake Nicaragua, and sees a massive, untapped gold mine, not in the ground, but in the transit of human bodies.
Yes. Vanderbilt approaches the impoverished, desperate Nicaraguan government and offers them a deal they simply cannot refuse. He proposes the creation of the Accessory Transit Company.
How exactly did his system work mechanically? It wasn't a canal yet, right?
No, it wasn't a canal. It was a multimodal transit system. Vanderbilt would load prospectors onto a massive ocean-going steamship in New York. They would sail down to the Caribbean port of Greytown at the mouth of the San Juan River in Nicaragua.
Okay, then what?
There, they would transfer onto smaller, shallow-draft river steamboats, designed specifically by Vanderbilt to navigate the rapids of the river.
So they steam up the river into the massive Lake Nicaragua and cross to the western shore.
Precisely. Once they reached the western shore of the lake, they disembarked and boarded a fleet of distinctive sky blue stagecoaches.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, these stagecoaches would race across that narrow 12-mile strip of land over a macadamized road Vanderbilt had built, delivering the passengers to the Pacific port of San Juan del Sur.
Where another massive Vanderbilt steamship is waiting with its engines running to take them straight up the coast to San Francisco.
The entire journey from New York to San Francisco via Nicaragua took roughly 25 days. It cut the travel time in half compared to the Panama route or the overland journey.
That is incredible for the time.
It was a logistical marvel, and it was wildly, unfathomably profitable for Vanderbilt.
And what did the Nicaraguan government get out of this arrangement? Because they essentially signed away the transit rights to their own country.
They received a very modest annual stipend from Vanderbilt, plus a theoretical percentage of the profits.
Theoretical?
Well, profits that Vanderbilt's accountants were notoriously skilled at hiding.
Right, of course.
But more importantly, the Nicaraguan elites, particularly the liberals and conservatives fighting their endless civil war, viewed the transit company as a potential source of leverage.
How so?
They saw the thousands of Americans passing through their country, not just as passengers, but as potential allies or pawns in their own domestic struggles.
Which sets the stage for one of the most surreal, audacious, and frankly bizarre chapters in the history of the Americas, the story of William Walker.
Yes, William Walker.
Let's frame this up. It's 1855. The conservative faction, based in Granada, has the upper hand in the Civil War. The liberals in Leon are getting crushed. They are facing total political annihilation and the loss of their lands and wealth. They are desperate.
And desperation breeds catastrophic decision-making.
Yeah.
The liberals realize they cannot defeat the conservatives with their own forces. They need an external shock to the system.
They need a mercenary force.
Exactly. So they sent agents to San Francisco to recruit a man who had already made a strange, infamous name for himself in the shadowy world of private military expeditions.
William Walker. Now, the sources paint a picture of a guy who is simultaneously a genius and a complete failure.
Walker is a fascinating psychological study of the era. He was a child prodigy from Tennessee. He graduated college summa cum laude at 14.
14.
By the time he was 24, he had earned a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania, studied medicine in Europe, passed the bar exam to become a lawyer in New Orleans, and then became a newspaper editor.
So he mastered 3 distinct, difficult professions before he turned 30.
But he was deeply restless, profoundly arrogant, and entirely unsuccessful at maintaining a normal life. He drifted to California during the gold rush, not to mine gold, but to chase a darker, more ambitious dream. Walker became a filibuster.
Now, we need to define that term in the 19th century context because it has nothing to do with politicians talking for 20 hours to delay a vote in the Senate, right?
Right. No. In the 1850s, a filibuster was an American adventurer who raised a private, unauthorized mercenary army to launch unprovoked military invasions into Latin American countries.
Just totally rogue.
Totally rogue. Their goal was to overthrow the local governments and establish themselves as rulers. It was the extreme, violent, rogue manifestation of the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were inherently ordained to conquer and civilize the continent.
And Walker had already tried this once before, right?
Yes. A few years earlier, he had invaded the Baja California Peninsula in Mexico with a handful of armed men, declared himself the president of the Republic of Sonora, and was promptly chased back across the U.S. border by the Mexican military, nearly starving to death in the process.
So he is a known rogue actor. He's failed at this already. Yet, the Nicaraguan liberals, sitting in Leon, look at this guy and say, yes, this is the solution to our conservative problem.
They offer him a land grant if he brings a private army to fight for their side.
And Walker accepts.
Eagerly. He manages to recruit a force of about 60 heavily armed, battle-hardened veterans of the Mexican-American War and various frontier conflicts. He calls them his immortals.
How dramatic.
They board a ship in San Francisco, sail out of Nicaragua, and plunge directly into the Civil War.
And the staggering thing is, his sheer audacity actually works.
Walker brings a level of brutal, modern military tactic to a war that had largely been fought with disorganized militias. He utilizes rapid maneuverability, repeating rifles, and a complete disregard for the traditional rules of engagement.
So he just steamrolls them.
In a series of shockingly swift, violent battles, Walker and his small band of American mercenaries managed to capture the conservative stronghold of Granada. He effectively wins the Civil War for the liberals.
The liberals must have been thrilled. They hired a contractor, the contractor exterminated the competition, and now it's time to hand the keys to the country over to the employers.
That is precisely what the liberals expected. But William Walker had absolutely no intention of acting as a subordinate.
Of course not.
The moment Granada fell, Walker realized that he controlled the most potent military force in the country. He immediately betrays the liberal generals who hired him. He stages a fraudulent election, surrounded by his armed American mercenaries, and formally declares himself the President of the Republic of Nicaragua.
Wait, so a private American citizen just steals an entire sovereign nation?
He just steals us.
And he has massive ambitions. He doesn't just want to rule Nicaragua. He wants to use it as a staging ground.
Walker envisioned an entire Central American empire, carved out by force, ruled by English-speaking Americans, and heavily integrated into the global economy.
So he's going to need a lot more men.
Right. To achieve this, he needed constant reinforcements. He needed thousands of young, aggressive American men to leave the U.S. and join his army in Nicaragua.
And to attract those men and to secure political backing from powerful forces within the United States, he makes a decision that is just chilling in its calculation. He revokes the Nicaraguan Constitution.
Specifically, he targets the abolition of slavery. Nicaragua had outlawed human slavery decades earlier upon achieving independence. Walker unilaterally decrees that the institution of slavery is reinstated in Nicaragua.
Why would he do that? I mean, he's from Tennessee, but he was living in California. This wasn't just a personal preference. This was a strategic, geopolitical move.
It was a deeply cynical, calculated maneuver designed to court the immense wealth and political power of the American South. In the 1850s, the United States was tearing itself apart over the expansion of slavery.
Right, the build-up to the Civil War.
Southern politicians, figures like Jefferson Davis, were terrified of losing their power in the U.S. Senate as more free states were admitted to the Union. Walker was sending a very clear message to the Southern aristocracy. Support my regime, send me men and money, and I will eventually annex Nicaragua to the United States as a massive new slave state, ensuring your political dominance.
He is attempting to merge his rogue empire with the deepest, darkest fault line of American domestic politics. It is a stunning escalation.
Truly stunning.
But for all his grand, terrifying geopolitical machinations, Walker's ultimate downfall doesn't come from a moral uprising or a U.S. government intervention. It comes because he commits the cardinal sin of 19th century capitalism.
He steals from Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Let's examine the mechanics of this mistake. Vanderbilt's accessory transit company is running smoothly, ferrying thousands of prospectors across Nicaragua right through the middle of Walker's newly conquered territory.
And Walker, suffering from deep delusions of grandeur, decides he wants to control the transit revenue entirely.
Bad idea.
He is approached by two of Vanderbilt's disgruntled former business partners. They convince Walker to simply revoke Vanderbilt's charter, seize the massive steamboats and the stagecoach infrastructure, and hand the entire, unimaginably lucrative company over to them.
And Walker does it. He just seizes Vanderbilt's property by decree. How does a man like Vanderbilt respond to having his crown jewels stolen by a freelance mercenary?
With overwhelming, disproportionate financial and logistical warfare, Vanderbilt doesn't appeal to the U.S. government. He takes matters into his own hands. First, he immediately halts all of his steamships on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. He completely severs the transit line.
Which instantly cuts off Walker's supply of fresh American recruits and weapons.
Exactly. Walker is suddenly isolated in the jungle. Then Vanderbilt uses his vast fortune to quietly fund, arm, and organize a massive coalition of the surrounding Central American nations, Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala.
Because they're scared of Walker, too.
They look at Walker and realize that if he consolidates power in Nicaragua, he will inevitably invade them next.
So Vanderbilt essentially hires multiple sovereign armies to act as his private security force.
He does. He even sends his own private military operatives to embed with the Costa Rican army, teaching them how to capture and sabotage the very river steamboats Walker had stolen, cutting off Walker's internal supply lines along the San Juan River.
The combined weight of Vanderbilt's wealth, the invading Central American armies, and the furious Nicaraguan populace who have united against the foreign invader regardless of whether they're liberal or conservative is simply too much. By 1857, Walker's army is starving, dying of cholera, and surrounded.
He is forced to surrender to a U.S. Navy officer who happened to be off the coast, and he is evacuated back to the United States.
Does he give up?
No. He attempts to launch subsequent invasions over the next few years, but the magic is gone. In 1860, he lands in Honduras, is captured by the British Royal Navy, who despised his disruption of their trade networks, and is handed over to the Honduran authorities.
And what do?
They promptly march him out to a courtyard and execute him by firing squad.
Wow. The William Walker saga is so chaotic it almost feels like a bizarre tangent. But the sources are adamant that we cannot understand modern Nicaragua without understanding the psychological scar Walker left behind.
The Walker episode is the foundational trauma of Nicaraguan foreign relations. Think about the humiliation suffered by the Liberal Party. They literally invited the vampire into the house.
Right. They hired a man to win a political argument, and he ended up destroying their cities, executing their leaders, and trying to enslave their population.
The Liberal Party was so thoroughly discredited by their association with Walker that they were locked out of power for the next 25 years. The Conservatives ruled uninterrupted.
But the broader national impact is even more profound.
The broader impact is the birth of an intense, deeply justified paranoia regarding the United States. Before Walker, the U.S. was an abstract concept, a distant trading partner. After Walker, every single Nicaraguan citizen understood viscerally that American private interests viewed their sovereign nation merely as a playground for profit and a staging ground for conquest.
It proved that Americans were willing to employ absolute violence to achieve economic dominance.
Exactly.
The foundation is cracking, the fault line is exposed, and the United States government, watching all of this unfold from Washington, draws a very specific lesson from the chaos. They don't look at Walker and think, whoa, we should leave Central America alone.
No. They look at the British meddling on the Mosquito Coast, they look at rogue actors like Walker disrupting trade, and they decide that freelance imperialism is too messy.
The United States transitions into a new era. They realize that if they do not assert formal, systemic, state-sponsored control over this vital geopolitical choke point, some other power, whether it's a European empire or a rogue mercenary, inevitably will.
The era of the filibuster ends, and the era of the empire begins.
Let's explore that transition. We are moving into the late 19th and early 20th century. After decades of conservative rule following the Walker disaster, the Liberal Party finally claws its way back into power in 1893, led by a man named José Santos Zelaya.
Zelaya is a monumental, highly contradictory figure in Nicaraguan history. He rules as a dictator from 1893 to 1909. But unlike the previous generation of elites who were content to fight over local spoils, Zelaya is an aggressive, visionary nationalist.
He looks at the map of his fractured country and decides he's going to forcefully forge it into a modern, unified, sovereign state.
And his first major move is finally dealing with the British on the Caribbean coast.
Right, because that British protectorate over the Mosquito Coast had been a thorn in Nicaragua's side for half a century.
Zelaya, banking on the fact that the British Empire is becoming increasingly overextended globally, sends the Nicaraguan military into the Eastern Territories. He formally reincorporates the region, dissolves the fictitious Mosquito Kingdom, and establishes undisputed Nicaraguan sovereignty from the Pacific to the Caribbean.
That is a massive nationalist triumph.
It is. But Zelaya's vision of a strong, modern nation requires capital. He needs money to build railroads, telegraph lines, and modern ports. And the way he goes about generating that capital makes him deeply unpopular with vast swaths of his own population.
Zelaya believes that the future of the Nicaraguan economy lies in mass agricultural export, specifically coffee.
Right. To achieve this, he implements sweeping, brutal land reforms. For centuries, rural indigenous communities and poor peasants had lived on communal lands called ejidos. They engaged in subsistence farming.
And Zelaya changes that.
He passes laws to forcibly privatize these communal lands, auctioning them off to wealthy, politically connected elites who can afford to build massive coffee plantations.
It's the violent enclosure of the commons.
Exactly. The peasants are violently evicted from their ancestral lands, and because they no longer have land to grow their own food, they are forced to become desperately poor, dependent wage laborers on the very coffee estates that displace them.
So he creates a modern export economy, but he builds it on the absolute immiseration of the rural working class.
And he doesn't just alienate the coffee workers. He also makes a devastating, highly controversial deal on the newly conquered Caribbean coast to promote the banana trade. He invites in a corporation whose name is synonymous with exploitation in Latin America.
The United Fruit Company.
The United Fruit Company.
Let's dissect this arrangement because it perfectly illustrates the mechanics of corporate imperialism. Zelaya wants to develop the banana industry around the port of Bluefields. The bananas are grown deep in the jungle by hundreds of small, independent Nicaraguan farmers. But Zelaya doesn't just sell land to United Fruit. He gives them a structural chokehold.
He grants the United Fruit Company an exclusive monopolistic concession over transportation on the Escondido River.
Why is that specific river concession so deadly to the local economy?
The Escondido River was the only viable artery connecting the deep jungle banana plantations to the deep-water port at Bluefields, where the ocean-going steamships docked. By controlling the river transit, United Fruit became what economists call a monopsony, the single, exclusive buyer in a market.
So an independent Nicaraguan farmer can grow the most beautiful bananas in the world, but he has no way to physically get them to the international market unless he puts them on a United Fruit riverboat.
Precisely. And because United Fruit controls the transit, they can dictate the price they pay the farmer. If the market rate for a bunch of bananas is 50 cents, United Fruit can offer 10 cents.
And if the farmer refuses,
United Fruit simply declines to transport their crop. The bananas rot in the jungle heat. The farmer goes bankrupt.
it transforms independent businessmen into utterly dependent serfs without United Fruit ever having to buy their farms. They just controlled the toll booth.
It was incredibly efficient corporate extraction. And while Zelaya thought he was modernizing the country by bringing in American capital, he was actually constructing an economic system that bred profound resentment among the small landowners and the peasantry.
So Zelaya is building a powder keg domestically, but his fatal miscalculation, the move that ultimately destroys him, happens on the international stage. Because Zelaya is still obsessed with the great Nicaraguan dream, the Transoceanic Canal.
He understands that whoever builds and controls a canal through Nicaragua will wield immense global power. However, he also recognizes that if he allows the United States to build it, Nicaragua will simply become an American protectorate. The U.S. will dictate his foreign and domestic policy to protect their investment.
He wants the canal, but he wants to maintain his sovereignty, so he looks for a different partner.
Acting as a proud, defiant nationalist, Zelaya begins aggressively courting European powers. He opens negotiations with the British, the Japanese, and most alarmingly to Washington, the German Empire. He offers them the concession to build the canal across Nicaragua.
I can only imagine the klaxons going off in the State Department when they heard the word Germany.
It triggered absolute panic in Washington. We have to contextualize this within the geopolitical doctrine of the era. The United States operated under the Monroe Doctrine, and specifically President Theodore Roosevelt's recent corollary to it. This doctrine explicitly stated that the United States viewed the entire Western Hemisphere as its exclusive sphere of influence, and that the U.S. claimed the right to act as an international police power to intervene in Latin American nations to prevent European empires from gaining a foothold.
The idea of the rapidly militarizing German Empire building a massive strategic infrastructure project, which would require a permanent German naval presence to protect it right in America's backyard, mere days away from the U.S. coast, was viewed as an existential threat.
It was an intolerable breach of the Monroe Doctrine. Washington decides unequivocally that Zelaya must be removed from power. The United States cannot allow an independent nationalist to dictate the terms of Central American geography.
The mechanics of how the U.S. orchestrates this removal in 1909 are fascinating because it's a blend of corporate money and military muscle.
The conservative faction in Nicaragua, largely based on the Caribbean coast at this point and deeply resentful of Zelaya's rule, senses the shift in Washington's attitude. They launch an armed rebellion against Zelaya.
But initially, Zelaya's forces are actually winning, right?
Yes. Zelaya commands a well-trained liberal army. He counterattacks, drives the conservative rebels out of the interior, and pins them down in the coastal port city of Bluefields. The rebellion is surrounded, outgunned, and on the verge of total collapse.
And then the United States Navy arrives.
U.S. warships steam into the harbor at Bluefields and dispatch heavily armed detachments of U.S. Marines. The official diplomatic justification presented to the world is that the Marines are landing solely to protect the lives and property of neutral American citizens living in the city.
But the operational reality creates a massive tactical advantage for the rebels.
The Marines immediately declare Bluefields and the surrounding area a neutral zone where all combat is strictly prohibited. Zelaya's army, which is poised to crush the rebellion, is suddenly barred from advancing.
Because if they fire on the city, they risk hitting U.S. Marines.
which would trigger a full-scale declaration of war by the United States.
The Marines essentially act as an impenetrable human shield for the conservative rebels. And while the rebels are safely resting behind this shield, they receive a massive logistical boost.
From Wall Street, American corporate interests, specifically companies like United Fruit, who hated Zelaya's attempts to regulate them, and American bankers who wanted access to Nicaraguan markets, pour hundreds of thousands of dollars in secret funding into the conservative war chest.
It's a privately funded coup shielded by the U.S. military.
Surrounded, bankrupt, and facing the combined might of the U.S. Navy and Wall Street capital, Zelaya realizes his position is hopeless. In late 1909, he resigns the presidency and flees into exile. By 1910, the U.S.-backed conservative faction marches into Managua and reclaims power.
But the United States does not simply hand the country back to the conservatives and sail away. They look at the instability of the past century and decide that indirect influence is no longer sufficient. They decide to systematically foreclose on the entire nation.
The U.S. State Department initiates a policy explicitly designed to Americanize the Nicaraguan economy and political system. The goal is to bind Nicaragua so tightly to American financial institutions that no future nationalist leader could ever threaten U.S. interests again.
How does a superpower fundamentally take over another country's economy in the early 1900s? What are the actual levers they pull?
They utilize sovereign debt as a weapon of control. Nicaragua was heavily indebted to European creditors, largely British banks, due to loans Zelaya taken out for his modernization projects.
Okay.
The U.S. State Department brokers a deal modeled on the Knox-Castrillo Treaty, though the exact mechanisms evolved over time, where a syndicate of major American banks, led by J.P. Morgan and Company and Brown Brothers, step in and purchase the entirety of Nicaragua's national debt.
So Nicaragua no longer owes money to London. They owe it entirely to Wall Street.
Exactly. But the American banks demand absolute security on their investment. They do not trust the Nicaraguan government to make the interest payments. Therefore, the United States forces Nicaragua to agree to the establishment of an American customs receivership.
Let's visualize this. What does a customs receivership look like on the ground?
In an era before income taxes, a nation's primary source of government revenue came from customs duties, the taxes levied on goods being imported and exported through the major seaports, like the port of Corinto. Under this new arrangement, the President of the United States directly appoints an American official, a Collector General of Customs.
So an American bureaucrat literally sits in the Nicaraguan port.
An American bureaucrat, backed by U.S. military authority, physically takes control of the customs houses. Every single Cordoba collected in taxes goes directly into the hands of this American official.
And what does he do with it?
The Collector General takes that revenue, first pays the massive interest installments owed to the Wall Street banks, then pays the salaries of his own American staff, and finally, whatever small fraction of revenue is left over is handed to the Nicaraguan government in Managua to run the country.
It is the ultimate humiliation. The sovereign nation of Nicaragua is placed on a meager allowance doled out by a foreign banker. They lose total control over their own macroeconomic policy.
And to guarantee that the Nicaraguan population doesn't rise up and overthrow this incredibly exploitative financial arrangement, the U.S. ensures the political system is completely rigged. They maintain a permanent armed garrison of U.S. Marines stationed in Managua, the capital city.
The physical manifestation of the threat.
The Marines serve as a Praetorian Guard. Their explicit understood purpose is to keep the pliant, subservient conservative government led by men like Emiliano Chamorro, who was essentially handpicked by the State Department in power.
Right.
They ensure that the nationalist liberals, the intellectual heirs of Zelaya, who might challenge the Wall Street bankers, are completely excluded from the political process through sham elections and intimidation.
This arrangement creates an intolerable pressure cooker. You have an impoverished peasantry, an alienated liberal middle class, a puppet government taking orders from the American legation, and foreign troops occupying the capital. It's a recipe for an explosion.
And the explosion inevitably comes. In the mid-1920s, the political exclusion becomes so absolute that the liberal faction decides they have nothing left to lose. They launch a massive, violent armed uprising against the U.S.-backed conservative government.
The country descends into full-scale civil war once again. The fighting is brutal, and it threatens the stability of the entire financial apparatus the U.S. has built. Washington realizes they need to stop the war immediately.
The U.S. sends a high-level diplomatic envoy, Henry Stimson, to broker a peace agreement. Stimson sits down with the exhausted leaders of both the liberal and conservative armies. He essentially dictates terms.
What are the terms?
The U.S. will supervise the next election to ensure fairness, but both sides must immediately lay down their weapons, accept the continued presence of U.S. Marines, and not challenge the fundamental American financial control of the country.
The exhausted elites from both factions look at the overwhelming military power of the U.S., look at their own battered armies, and agree. They sign the Espino Negro Pact in 1927. The war is officially over.
But the peace is an illusion. Because while the wealthy generals signed the treaty, one relatively obscure liberal commander operating deep in the northern mountains looks at the agreement, recognizes it as a complete capitulation, and refuses to lay down his rifle.
Augusto César Sandino.
The man who will become the defining ghost of modern Nicaraguan history.
We need to spend significant time examining Sandino because he is the archetype, the mold from which the entire future revolution will be cast. He wasn't a wealthy elite from Leon, but he wasn't exactly a poor peasant either. Who is he?
Sandino's background is crucial to understanding his worldview. He was the illegitimate son of a moderately wealthy liberal landowner and an indigenous servant woman. He grew up experiencing the stark, brutal class divisions of Nicaraguan society firsthand. As a young man, he was involved in a violent dispute, shot a man, and was forced to flee the country to avoid arrest.
He goes into exile, and this exile serves as his political awakening.
He travels widely, he works in Honduras. Crucially, he spends significant time in Tampico, Mexico, during the height of the radical anti-imperialist fervor of the Mexican Revolution. He absorbs these ideas.
And he also works in the belly of the beast. He experiences the reality of American corporate extraction firsthand.
When he eventually returns to Nicaragua, he takes a job as a mechanic and a payroll clerk on the Caribbean coast. He works at the Bragman's Bluff lumber operation and the American-owned Luz Mining Company in the remote northern mountains.
So he isn't reading about imperialism in a library in Amagua. He is watching it happen.
He is seeing the daily, grinding exploitation. He watches indigenous workers and poor peasants laboring deep underground in horrific, dangerous conditions, earning starvation wages paid in company scrip that can only be spent at the company store, while the vast profits of the gold and silver are shipped directly to boardrooms in New York and Boston.
He sees the systemic extraction. So when Henry Stimson brokers this peace deal between the liberal and conservative elites in 1927, Sandino rejects it completely. To him, what does this treaty represent?
To Sandino, the Espino Negro Pact was the ultimate proof of elite betrayal. He realizes that the traditional political parties, the liberals and the conservatives, are completely morally bankrupt. They are just two factions of the same corrupt aristocracy, willing to sell out the sovereignty of the nation for the privilege of managing the U.S. occupation.
This is where Sandino formulates a genuinely revolutionary new ideology. The notes emphasize that he creates a unique fusion that had never really existed in Nicaragua before.
It is the ideological bedrock of the 20th century struggle. Previous leaders, even strong nationalists like Zelaya, separated economic issues from foreign policy. Zelaya wanted sovereignty, but he was fine with brutalizing peasants to grow coffee.
Right.
Sandino fuses three distinct pillars into a single, cohesive worldview: uncompromising nationalism, fierce anti-Americanism, and radical social justice.
How does he connect those dots for the people following him?
He articulated a very clear chain of causality. He argued that the crushing poverty of the Nicaraguan peasant wasn't a natural state of affairs, and it wasn't the will of God. It was the direct, engineered result of foreign corporate exploitation, the mining and banana companies.
Right.
But those foreign corporations could only operate so brutally because they were protected by the military might of the United States Marines. And the U.S. Marines were only in the country because a corrupt, spineless Nicaraguan elite invited them in and signed away the national sovereignty.
So you can't fix the poverty without fixing the sovereignty.
Exactly. You cannot achieve social justice without asserting true nationalism. And you cannot assert nationalism until you militarily drive the United States out of the country entirely. The pillars cannot be separated.
It's an incredibly potent, resonant message. And the people who flock to his banner, his defending army of national sovereignty, aren't the wealthy politicians from the cities.
His recruits are the marginalized. They are the miners he worked alongside at the Luz Mining Company. They are the dispossessed indigenous peasants driven off their lands by the coffee expansion. They are the people who have suffered the most intimate daily violence under the system the U.S. constructed.
Sandino retreats into the rugged, impenetrable jungles and mountains of northern Nicaragua, specifically the Segovia region, and launches a fierce guerrilla war aimed directly at the American occupation. And the response from the United States military is absolute, devastating fury.
The counterinsurgency campaign waged by the U.S. Marines against Sandino in the late 1920s and early 1930s is a dark, often overlooked chapter of American military history. It is, in many profound ways, a direct precursor to the tactical and moral quagmires of the Vietnam War.
The parallels in this historical record are chilling. The U.S. sends thousands of highly equipped Marines into incredibly difficult, hostile jungle terrain to hunt down a deeply motivated, highly mobile guerrilla force.
The Marines face an enemy they cannot easily identify. Sandino's fighters don't wear traditional uniforms. They blend seamlessly into the local peasant population, who provide them with food, shelter, and vital intelligence regarding American troop movements. The U.S. military is fighting a ghost.
And when a conventional military fights a frustrated, invisible war, the tactics inevitably escalate into terror. The U.S. introduces a terrifying new weapon to this conflict.
This conflict marks one of the earliest extensive uses of aerial bombardment in counterinsurgency warfare. The U.S. military deployed aircraft, like the Curtiss F-8C Falcon dive bombers, to strike at suspected rebel strongholds deep in the mountains.
But they weren't just bombing military camps, were they?
In the frustration of the campaign, the distinction between combatant and civilian completely eroded. U.S. aircraft bombed civilian villages suspected of harboring Sandinista sympathizers. The bombing of the town of Ocotal in 1927 resulted in significant civilian casualties and sparked international outrage.
On the ground, the brutality was intimate and horrific. It became a war of psychological terror.
When U.S. Marines and their local Nicaraguan auxiliaries captured suspected rebels or peasant collaborators, the interrogations and executions were gruesome. There are documented accounts of beheadings where severed heads were photographed or displayed as grim warnings to other villages not to support the insurgency.
And Sandino's forces responded with equally grotesque violence against the Americans and anyone they viewed as a collaborator.
Sandino's guerrillas utilized a notoriously horrific execution method known as the corte de chaleco, or the vest cut.
I read the description of this in the notes, and it is stomach-churning.
When they captured a U.S. Marine or a Nicaraguan working with the occupation, they would use a machete to amputate the victim's arms and legs and often decapitate them, leaving only the torso, the part of the body a vest would cover.
Oh my God.
They would leave the mutilated remains on the jungle trails to instill absolute terror in the pursuing American patrols. It was a spiral of grotesque retaliatory violence.
Yet, despite the dive bombers, despite the thousands of troops, the United States cannot break Sandino. He survives every offensive. The war settles into a bloody, exhausting stalemate, but then an event thousands of miles away fundamentally alters the trajectory of the conflict.
In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashes, ushering in the Great Depression.
The economic reality at home dictates foreign policy.
The American public and the U.S. Congress, facing massive unemployment and breadlines at home, entirely lose their appetite for funding a costly, seemingly endless, and deeply unpopular counterinsurgency war in the jungles of Central America. The political calculus in Washington changes. They need an exit strategy. They need to bring the Marines home.
But they don't want to just abandon their financial interests or leave a vacuum for Sandino to fill. They need to Nicaraguanize the consulate.
They need a proxy force. The U.S. military begins aggressively recruiting, arming, and training a new, supposedly nonpartisan national military and police force. They call it the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard.
The idea is that American officers will train them, equip them with modern weapons, and then hand over the counterinsurgency war to local Nicaraguans. But to make this work, Washington needs to select a commander for this new force who is absolutely, unquestionably loyal to American interests.
They look past the traditional military generals and select a man named Anastasio Somoza Garcia.
Somoza. This is the moment the most destructive dynasty in Central American history is born. Who is he at this point? He isn't a war hero.
Not at all. Somoza's background was remarkably unaristocratic. He had been a moderately successful politician, but his early career involved stints as a used car salesman, a meter reader, and there were even credible allegations that he had been involved in a counterfeiting ring.
So why does the U.S. military hand the most powerful weapon in the country to a guy with that resume?
Because Somoza possessed the exact skill set the Americans valued most. He was exceptionally charming, incredibly cunning, and he spoke absolutely flawless colloquial American English, having been educated at a business school in Philadelphia.
He knew how to talk to them.
He knew how to flatter American diplomats, play poker with the Marine commanders, and tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. Washington viewed him as a highly manageable, entirely reliable asset who would protect their financial architecture once the Marines left.
So January 1933 arrives. The U.S. Marines finally pack up their gear, board their transport ships in Corinto, and sail away. The occupation is officially over.
Sandino, watching from the mountains, looks at the departing ships and makes a monumental decision. His singular goal, the expulsion of the foreign invader, has been achieved. True to his word, he declares a ceasefire.
Right.
He sends messages to the newly elected civilian president in Managua, Juan Bautista Sacasa, offering to negotiate a formal peace treaty and demobilize his guerrilla army.
Sandino travels down from the mountains to the capital, Managua, in early 1934 to finalize the peace terms. And this is a moment of immense historical tension, because Sandino is a national hero. He is the David who fought the American Goliath to a standstill. He is universally beloved by the working class.
But Anastasio Somoza, sitting across the city in the headquarters of the heavily armed National Guard, views Sandino through an entirely different lens. Somoza doesn't care about national heroism. He cares about raw power.
Right.
He looks at Sandino's massive popularity and recognizes an existential political threat. Somoza realizes that a peaceful, politically active Sandino could easily win an election and eclipse him entirely.
Somoza decides that the only way to secure his own absolute power is to eliminate the rival, and he executes a plan of staggering treachery.
On the evening of February 21st, 1934, Sandino attends a dinner hosted by the civilian president Sacasa at the presidential palace. They are finalizing the terms of the peace agreement. Sandino believes he is operating under a flag of truce, protected by the honor of the government.
But the civilian president doesn't control the men with the guns.
As Sandino leaves the dinner and his car begins to drive down the hill from the palace, it is intercepted by a heavily armed detachment of National Guard troops, acting on the direct, secret orders of Anastasio Somoza. Sandino and his top lieutenants are dragged from the vehicle, taken to an empty airfield on the outskirts of the city, and executed by a firing squad.
Wow.
They are buried in unmarked graves that have never been found.
Somoza believes he has solved his problem. He believes that by putting bullets into Sandino, he has killed the revolution.
It is the ultimate demonstration of the law of unintended consequences. Somoza succeeded in extinguishing Sandino the mortal man, but in doing so, he permanently immortalized Sandino the martyr.
Right.
By murdering him under a flag of truce, Somoza elevated Sandino into an untouchable, mythic symbol of pure Nicaraguan resistance and incorruptible nationalism.
The stark, absolute contrast between the two men becomes the defining paradigm of the next 50 years. You have Sandino, the man who lived in the jungle, fought for the poor, and was murdered for demanding sovereignty. And you have Somoza, the man who used foreign backing and treachery to murder his rival so he could steal the country.
And steal it he does. With Sandino dead and the civilian government entirely intimidated by the power of the National Guard, Somoza essentially clears the runway for his own ambitions. In 1936, he forces the civilian president to resign, stages a sham election controlled entirely by his troops, and officially assumes the presidency.
This inaugurates the Somoza dynasty. For the next 4 decades, this single family operates Nicaragua not as a sovereign republic, but as a privately owned corporate fiefdom. The sources describe it as a kleptocracy of staggering proportions.
The scale and mechanics of the Somoza family's corruption are difficult to comprehend. Anastasio Somoza Sr. utilized the absolute terror and authority of the National Guard to systematically annex the nation's wealth. He didn't just skim tax revenue, he swallowed entire industries.
How did the extortion practically work? If I'm a wealthy Nicaraguan who owns a profitable cattle ranch, how does Somoza take it?
Somoza would approach you with an offer to buy your ranch at a fraction of its actual value. If you refused his generous offer, you would suddenly find that the government had revoked your export licenses.
Oh, wow.
Or a detachment of National Guard troops would set up a checkpoint on the only road leading to your ranch, preventing your cattle from getting to market. You would be economically strangled until you surrendered and sold the property to Somoza for pennies.
He used the regulatory power of the state to enforce a mafia racket.
Precisely. A perfect example is the milk industry in Managua. Somoza decided he wanted to monopolize dairy sales, so he purchased a pasteurization plant. Then, as president, he passed a strict public health law requiring that all milk sold in the capital must be pasteurized.
Oh my gosh.
Since he owned the only functional pasteurization plant, every independent dairy farmer was instantly forced out of business or forced to sell their milk to Somoza at his dictated price.
Through these methods, over the decades, the Somoza family accumulates an empire that includes the national airline, the shipping lines, massive coffee and sugar plantations, media outlets, and industrial plants. At their peak, economic historians estimate the family personally controlled roughly 30% of the entire arable land and wealth of the nation.
One family, 30% of a country. And he maintains this incredibly fragile, deeply resented domestic racket through one vital, overarching strategy: absolute, unquestioning subservience to the geopolitical needs of the United States.
He knows who signs his permission slip.
He recognizes that as long as Washington supports him, his domestic opposition cannot overthrow him. When World War II breaks out, Somoza immediately declares war on the Axis powers, not because Nicaragua had any stake in the global conflict, but simply to signal his unwavering loyalty to the Roosevelt administration.
And the U.S. rewards him with massive shipments of modern military equipment under the Lend-Lease program, further strengthening his grip on power.
And when the geopolitical winds shift after the war, he shifts with them. When the Cold War begins in the late 1940s, Somoza seamlessly rebrands himself. He goes from being a wartime ally to presenting himself as the fiercest, most reliable anti-communist crusader in Central America. He outlaws leftist parties, crushes labor unions, and constantly reminds Washington that without his iron fist, Nicaragua would fall to Soviet influence.
This ensures a continuous, uninterrupted flow of U.S. economic aid and military training for his National Guard. But they still bother to hold elections every few years, right? Just to maintain the veneer of legitimacy for the international community.
They practiced the illusion of democracy. They permitted a very tame, compliant faction of the Conservative Party to exist and field candidates. But the outcomes were predetermined. The National Guard literally controlled the physical ballot boxes.
Right.
If the vote tallying in a district started looking unfavorable, the Guard would simply seize the boxes, alter the ballots in a back room, and announce a massive victory for Somoza. Somoza himself famously joked to U.S. President Harry Truman about the elections, basically admitting that the opposition could count the votes, but Somoza counted the ballot boxes.
This suffocating, corrupt stagnation goes on for 20 years. Somoza seems invincible. He has the guns, the money, and the backing of the superpower. But in 1956, the dictator's run comes to a sudden, violent end.
It ends not via a massive rebel army, but at the hands of a single, deeply alienated individual. Anastasio Somoza Sr. is attending a poetry reading and social dance in the city of Leon. A young, fiercely nationalist Nicaraguan poet named Rigoberto Lopez Perez manages to bypass the security detail, draws a revolver, and shoots the dictator multiple times.
Somoza is severely wounded. He is rushed by a U.S. military helicopter to a specialized American military hospital in the Panama Canal Zone, a final testament to his deep ties to Washington. But the surgical efforts fail. He dies a few days later.
His assassination instantly plunges the deeply entrenched regime into a profound succession crisis. The vast, sprawling kleptocracy now lacks a head. The power structure falls to his two sons, who had been groomed for leadership: Luis Somoza Debayle and Anastasio Somoza Debayle, universally known by his nickname, Tacho.
When you look at the psychological dynamic between these two brothers trying to run a corrupt family empire after the violent death of the patriarch, it is incredibly reminiscent of classic familial dramas about power and succession. You have the older brother trying to legitimize the operation, and the younger brother who only understands violence.
It is a profound archetype. Luis, the older brother, is the cerebral, calculating pragmatist. He ascends to the presidency following his father's death. Luis looks at the sprawling, multi-million-dollar economic empire the family has built and realizes it is incredibly vulnerable.
Because everyone hates them.
Right. He understands that their absolute, brutal monopoly on political power has made them deeply hated, not just by the poor peasants, but by the traditional wealthy elite classes who feel entirely shut out of the country's economic life.
Luis realizes the pressure cooker is going to explode if they don't open the valve.
He wants to orchestrate a transition. Luis believes that to protect the family's immense wealth, they need to step back from the brutal, day-to-day political repression that characterized his father's rule. He initiates a period of relative liberalization. He relaxes censorship, allows the traditional opposition parties a bit more breathing room to debate in the Congress, and signals a willingness to eventually transition the family out of the direct presidency.
He wants the Somozas to operate like powerful oligarchs, pulling the economic strings behind the scenes, rather than functioning as universally despised absolute dictators.
But the modernization plan is cut short. Luis suffers from severe, chronic health issues, specifically heart disease and diabetes. His health rapidly deteriorates, and he dies of a massive heart attack in 1963.
Which leaves the entire apparatus in the hands of the younger brother, Tacho.
Tacho represents a total regression. He's the commander of the National Guard, and his worldview is fundamentally opposed to his brother's pragmatism. Tacho completely rejects Luis's strategy of liberalization. Tacho is arrogant, deeply entrenched in the military culture of the Guard, and he believes his father's original methodology was the only way to govern. He believes that showing any political weakness or allowing any genuine opposition will inevitably lead to the destruction of the family. He demands total, unquestioning submission, enforced by the ruthless application of brute force.
Tacho takes direct control of the presidency and immediately slams the pressure valve shut. He ramps up the repression, shuts down the opposition press, and utilizes the National Guard to terrorize any dissenters.
And in doing so, he blindly sets the stage for his own catastrophic demise. He believes he is projecting strength, but he's actually radicalizing his own population.
Which brings us to the forces gathering in the shadows, because a heavily armed, U.S.-backed dictatorship can survive grinding rural poverty and rigged elections for decades. But it cannot survive when the very ground beneath it literally shatters, exposing the absolute rot at the core of the system.
To understand the ultimate collapse of the regime, we have to look at the emergence of a new type of opposition. In 1961, inspired profoundly by the recent success of Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba, a small group of young, Marxist-leaning Nicaraguan intellectuals form a new revolutionary vanguard.
They need a name that connects their Marxist ideology to the deep, visceral nationalism of the Nicaraguan people.
They name themselves after the Great Martyr. They become the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FSLN. The key founding figures include Carlos Fonseca, Tomás Borge, and later, a young militant named Daniel Ortega.
Now, in the 1960s, the Sandinistas are not a massive, terrifying army. They are actually struggling to survive.
Initially, they are largely a failure. They attempt to strictly replicate the Cuban FOCO theory, the idea that a small, dedicated band of guerrillas can insert themselves into the deep rural mountains, radicalize the local peasantry through armed action, and spark a nationwide uprising.
But the geography and demographics of Nicaragua are different from Cuba.
And more importantly, Cacho Somoza's National Guard is incredibly well-equipped with U.S. counterinsurgency training and modern weaponry.
Throughout the 60s, the Guard hunts down these small Sandinista columns in the mountains and massacres them. They are decimated repeatedly. The regime views the FSLN as a radical fringe nuisance, not an existential threat to the state.
They remained isolated and largely ineffective until the defining catalyst of modern Nicaraguan history occurs.
December 23, 1972.
Shortly after midnight, a massive, catastrophic earthquake strikes directly along the fault lines beneath the capital city of Managua. The shallow depth of the quake makes it incredibly destructive. In a matter of minutes, the entire downtown core of the city is pulverized. Between 10 and 20,000 people are crushed to death in the rubble. Hundreds of thousands are left instantly homeless. The infrastructure, water, power, hospitals is totally obliterated.
It is a humanitarian nightmare of apocalyptic proportions. The international community reacts immediately. Millions of dollars in relief aid, food, medical supplies, and temporary housing materials begin pouring into the country from the United States, Europe, and neighboring Latin American nations.
And this is the moment where Tacho Somoza's greed crosses a psychological threshold from which the regime can never, ever return.
Somoza declares martial law and puts his beloved National Guard in absolute charge of coordinating the emergency response and distributing the international relief aid.
But instead of functioning as a rescue force, the National Guard operates as an occupying army of looters. They systematically hoard the incoming international aid. Guard officers ensure their own families and loyalists receive massive stockpiles of food and medicine first.
And
Then they begin aggressively selling the donated life-saving supplies on the black market at extortionate prices to the starving, desperate survivors in the ruined city. There are documented reports of the Guard literally selling donated blood plasma while victims bled to death in makeshift clinics.
And the extortion wasn't just limited to the supplies. The mechanics of their profiteering reached an almost cartoonish level of cruelty.
The vast majority of the residents whose homes were destroyed in the city center were forcibly evacuated by the military to sprawling, squalid tent cities constructed on the far outskirts of Managua. However, these people desperately needed to travel back into the dangerous, rubble-strewn downtown to search for missing relatives, attempt to salvage any surviving inventory from their ruined businesses, or recover buried valuables.
They needed transportation.
And Somoza's business cronies, backed by the National Guard, completely monopolized the limited bus routes running between the refugee camps and the city center. They charged exorbitant, constantly rising fares to the desperate, traumatized refugees just for the privilege of riding a bus to dig through the ruins of their own lives. The regime was literally systematically profiteering off the rubble of its own capital.
I want to focus deeply on what this specific visceral cruelty does to the psychology of the country. Because the historical consensus points to this earthquake response as the precise moment the middle class radicalizes. And when we say middle class in the context of 1970s Nicaragua, we are not talking about wealthy stockbrokers or corporate executives.
No, we're talking about the fragile, striving bourgeoisie. We're talking about mom-and-pop operations, the independent bicycle repairmen, the people running tiny corner grocery stores out of the front rooms of their houses, the independent auto mechanics, the small-scale printers.
These are people who, for decades, had largely stayed out of politics. They weren't revolutionaries. They kept their heads down. They paid their daily required bribes to the local National Guardsmen on the corner to keep their business license active, and they just tried to survive and feed their kids.
But the sheer brazen inhumanity of the earthquake response shatters the fundamental social contract entirely. It stripped away any lingering, desperate illusion that the Somoza regime, despite its corruption, provided some baseline level of order or stability. When a small business owner watches his life's work collapse into rubble and then watches a government soldier steal the donated food meant for his children and sell it back to him, a profound psychological shift occurs.
Yeah.
They realize the regime isn't just corrupt. It is a malignant, parasitic entity that is actively destroying them.
And the teenagers and university students who watch their parents being humiliated and extorted by the Guard while the city rots, they don't channel their anger into joining the traditional, compliant conservative party.
No, the traditional opposition is viewed as entirely impotent and compromised. These furious, urban, middle-class youths flock directly to the only group actively fighting the regime, the FSLN. The Sandinistas suddenly find themselves flooded with an entirely new demographic of recruits. It's no longer just isolated rural peasants. It's thousands of educated, deeply motivated urban youths willing to take up arms, build barricades, and launch urban guerrilla warfare.
And precisely as this massive wave of political fury is boiling over, the macroeconomic floor falls out from under the country.
It is the convergence of political and economic disaster. During the 1960s, the Nicaraguan economy had actually experienced a period of significant growth. This was largely fueled by immense agricultural exports, specifically cotton, sugar, and beef. And the primary driver of that demand was the United States, which needed vast amounts of raw materials to supply the massive American military and industrial effort during the Vietnam War.
But by the early to mid-1970s, the geopolitical winds shift again. The United States begins drawing down its forces in Vietnam. The massive wartime demand evaporates.
The global prices for cotton and sugar plummet. The Nicaraguan export economy, which is heavily reliant on those few commodities, crashes. Unemployment skyrockets. Inflation spirals out of control. The economic misery compounds the fury generated by the earthquake corruption.
So by the late 70s, Tacho Somoza is facing a revitalized, increasingly capable Marxist insurgency, a completely furious and radicalized middle class, and a collapsing economy. He is isolated in his bunker. But he still controls the heavily armed National Guard, and crucially, he still enjoys a very hesitant, uneasy tolerance from the traditional, ultra-wealthy business elites, the bankers and massive landowners who despise him but fear a Marxist revolution even more.
They view Somoza as a necessary, brutal evil to protect their property rights. Until January 1978, that is the terminal turning point.
The assassination of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro.
Pedro Chamorro was the publisher of La Prensa, the most prominent, widely read opposition newspaper in the country. He belonged to one of the oldest, wealthiest, most aristocratic conservative families in Nicaragua. For decades, he had utilized his newspaper to wage a relentless editorial war against Somoza's corruption, exposing the regime's massive embezzlement and horrific human rights abuses.
And his reporting was starting to cause real problems for Somoza internationally.
Exactly. Chamorro's exposés were being picked up by the international press. The newly elected Carter administration in the U.S., which had declared human rights a pillar of its foreign policy, was reading these reports. Congress was threatening to cut off the vital military aid that kept the National Guard functioning. Chamorro was becoming an existential threat to the regime's survival.
So Tacho Somoza decides to handle the problem the only way he knows how. He resorts to ultimate violence. He has Pedro Chamorro ambushed and assassinated by hitmen in broad daylight on the crowded streets of Managua.
When we examine the structural political impact of that specific assassination, It is staggering. By ordering the murder of Pedro Chamorro, Somoza fatally broke the unwritten fundamental rules of the game that governed Nicaraguan society.
Explain those rules. What boundary did he cross?
The Nicaraguan elites operated under a tacit, deeply cynical understanding. They accepted that the dictator would rig the elections. They accepted that he would steal millions from the treasury. They even accepted that the National Guard would torture and massacre poor peasants or radical students in the mountains. But there was an absolute line. You did not murder a wealthy, prominent, internationally recognized member of the traditional aristocracy in the capital city.
By gunning down Chamorro, Somoza shatters the illusion of safety for the upper class. He essentially broadcasts a message to every millionaire banker, every massive plantation owner, and every conservative politician. My survival is the only thing that matters. None of you are safe.
Precisely. The assassination achieves a political miracle that the Sandinistas could never have orchestrated on their own. It entirely bridges the class divide. The wealthy, conservative business elites who had previously funded Somoza's guards out of a deep fear of the Marxists suddenly realize that Somoza, in his paranoia, is actually the greater, more immediate threat to their lives.
They decide they have to burn the house down to kill the dictator.
They throw their massive financial resources, their political connections, and their logistical support entirely behind the revolution. They organize nationwide general strikes that completely paralyze the economy, starving the regime of tax revenue.
You witness the formation of this bizarre, unprecedented, highly fragile coalition. You have hardened Marxist guerrillas in the mountains, coordinating strategy with furious, radicalized Catholic priests in the slums, supported by angry bicycle repairmen, and funded by millionaire conservative bankers. They all agree on exactly one thing. The Somoza dynasty must be eradicated.
Facing a country entirely united against him, a collapsing economy, and a U.S. administration that has finally cut off his weapons supply, the regime's defenses crumble. In mid-1979, the Sandinistas launched their massive, coordinated final offensive. The National Guard, unpaid, demoralized, and surrounded by a hostile population, simply disintegrates. The soldiers abandon their uniforms and flee. On July 19, 1979, the Sandinista columns marched triumphantly into the capital.
Tacho Somoza realizes the dynasty has fallen. 2 days prior, he boards his private jet, loaded with his family and closest cronies, and flees into exile in Miami. But he cannot leave without one final, deeply morbid act of symbolic theft.
In a gesture that perfectly encapsulates the dark, parasitic nature of the regime, Somoza realizes he cannot leave his father's remains behind to be desecrated by the furious populace. He orders his men to use a backhoe to dig up the graves of Anastasio Somoza Sr. He physically loads his father's exhumed casket onto the jet. The dynasty of greed literally packs up its dead, its stolen gold, and escapes the country it ruined.
The dictator is gone. The streets of Managua are filled with hundreds of thousands of people celebrating. The statues of Somoza are being pulled down. You can imagine the pure, unadulterated euphoria. A 40-year nightmare is over. But history doesn't stop for celebrations. We are moving into a deeply complex era where a newly victorious, somewhat moderate Marxist revolution collides violently with the uncompromising realities of the late Cold War. Because in 1979, a successful revolution in America's geopolitical backyard was never going to be allowed the space to simply rebuild in peace.
The geopolitical reality reasserts itself almost the moment the cheering stops. The immediate challenge is governing a devastated nation. Initially, the new revolutionary government attempts to present a unified front to the world. They form a junta of national reconstruction, a broad governing coalition designed to represent the diverse groups that overthrew Somoza. Crucially, this junta includes moderate, internationally respected figures, most notably Violeta Chamorro, the widow of the assassinated journalist Pedro Chamorro, representing the conservative business class that supported the uprising.
So the Sandinistas are demonstrating a willingness to share power with the capitalists.
On paper, it appears as a true coalition. But in reality, the power dynamics quickly shift. The Sandinista comandantes, the hardened guerrilla leaders like Daniel Ortega, Tomas Borge, and Jaime Huilac rapidly consolidate ultimate functional authority. And the underlying reason is incredibly simple. Political power ultimately grows out of the barrel of a gun. The Sandinista guerrilla army has systematically transformed itself into the new, official national military and state police force. The moderates in the coalition, like Violeta Chamorro, had immense moral authority, but they did not command armed battalions. Recognizing that she was increasingly being sidelined and used as a moderate figurehead by the Marxist core, Violeta Chamorro resigns from the junta in frustration within the first year.
So the FSLN, the Sandinistas, are fully in charge. They control the state apparatus and the military. They are openly Marxist in their ideology, and they have clear diplomatic and ideological ties to Cuba and the Soviet Union. Now, let me push back here on the historical mechanics, because my understanding of the classic 20th century Marxist-Leninist playbook is that on day one of a successful revolution, you seize the commanding heights of the economy. You expropriate all private property, nationalize the farms, take over the factories, and eliminate the capitalist class entirely. But the Sandinistas don't actually do that. They allow massive, privately owned agricultural estates to remain in the hands of wealthy, conservative landowners. That seems entirely counterintuitive to their stated ideology.
It is a profound, fascinating deviation from the standard Soviet or Cuban model, and there is a very specific strategic reason behind it. The Sandinista leadership was actively consulting with and being mentored by Fidel Castro, and Castro, analyzing the Nicaraguan situation, explicitly warned them not to repeat the catastrophic economic mistakes he had made in Cuba in 1959.
Fidel Castro advising a revolution to moderate its radicalism.
Yes, out of sheer economic pragmatism. Castro had aggressively seized all private property and businesses in Cuba overnight. This triggered an immediate, massive flight of capital, completely destroyed the managerial and technical class who fled to Miami, and crippled the Cuban agricultural sector, leading to severe shortages that lasted for years. Castro looked at Nicaragua, a country whose infrastructure was already pulverized by an earthquake and a civil war, and told the Sandinistas that their economy was simply too fragile to survive the shock of total, immediate socialization. They needed the technical expertise and the capital of the bourgeoisie to keep the country fed.
So if they don't implement pure state communism, what economic system do they actually construct?
They attempt to engineer a mixed economy, a complex and often contradictory hybrid. They absolutely immediately seized all the massive land holdings and businesses previously owned by the Somoza family and his closest cronies, which, remember, constituted roughly 30% of the entire national wealth. They redistributed much of this land to landless peasants to form agricultural cooperatives. But crucially, they allowed the traditional, wealthy, non-Somoza landowners and industrialists to keep their massive private estates and factories. However, there was a massive, highly regulated catch.
The efficiency mandate?
Precisely. As long as a private farm or factory was deemed efficient and productive by the state, it was left in private hands. The government needed them growing coffee and sugar to generate foreign currency. However, the state instituted a powerful legal mechanism known as the decapitalization law.
How did that function day to day? How do you prove someone is decapitalizing a business?
It was a system built on profound mistrust. The government empowered workers' unions within private factories and farms to monitor the owners. If a capitalist owner, fearing the Marxist direction of the government, decided to quietly sabotage the revolution by intentionally running their business into the ground, perhaps by halting necessary investment, letting vital machinery rust, or secretly transferring capital to foreign bank accounts, the workers would report them. The state then had the legal authority to intervene, seize the failing business, and hand it over to the workers. It kept the business class in a state of constant paranoia, but it forced them to keep producing.
And the state also maintained a strict chokehold on the profits, right? The farmers could grow the crop, but they couldn't just sell it on the open global market.
Yes. The private estates could grow the sugar, the coffee, or the cotton, but the Sandinista government nationalized all foreign trade. The private farmers were legally mandated to sell their entire harvest to the government at a fixed internal price. The state then handled all international exports, selling the commodities on the global market and retaining a significant portion of the international profit to fund the revolutionary state.
And what were they funding with that massive revenue stream? Because this is where the social justice pillar of Sandino's ideology actually manifests in reality.
They directed massive resources into sweeping social programs aimed at the poorest sectors of society. Most famously, they launched the Cruzada Nacional de Alfabetización, the National Literacy Crusade. The government mobilized tens of thousands of urban high school and university students, sending them deep into the remote, impoverished countryside for months at a time to teach illiterate peasant farmers how to read and write. It was a massive success, dramatically dropping the national illiteracy rate. They also constructed free medical clinics and initiated massive vaccination drives in rural areas that had literally never seen a doctor in the country's history.
And politically, they eventually seek a democratic mandate.
In 1984, the Sandinistas hold national elections. Daniel Ortega runs for president as the FSLN candidate. And despite the deeply polarized atmosphere, International observers, including delegations from Western European democracies, widely reported that it was the fairest, most transparent, and least fraudulent election in the entire violent history of Nicaragua. Ortega wins a decisive, overwhelming mandate from the population.
So if you look at it objectively from an internal perspective, they are running a pragmatic, mixed economy, they are radically improving literacy and healthcare for the poor, and they legitimize their rule through a fair election. But Washington, D.C. looks at the exact same facts on the ground and sees an existential nightmare. They see a Soviet beachhead expanding in Central America.
The perception in Washington was deeply colored by the zero-sum logic of the Cold War. It must be said, the Sandinistas' own rhetoric frequently exacerbated the tension. They were fiercely, loudly, openly anti-American in their public pronouncements, constantly railing against Yankee imperialism. Given the history of the U.S. Marines, Walker, and Somoza, their hostility was historically entirely understandable. But in the tense geopolitical context of the early 1980s, openly courting Soviet aid and Cuban military advisors while screaming anti-American slogans was a guaranteed way to invite the wrath of the superpower.
The U.S. response transitions dramatically depending on who is sitting in the Oval Office.
The Carter administration had initially attempted a policy of cautious diplomatic engagement and economic aid, hoping to moderate the Sandinistas and pull them away from the Soviet orbit. But that approach failed as the Sandinistas deepened their ties with Havana and Moscow. When Ronald Reagan takes office in 1981, the U.S. strategy undergoes a radical, aggressive shift. The Reagan doctrine explicitly calls for the active, violent rollback of Soviet influence globally. The U.S. decides the Sandinista government must be destabilized and removed. The CIA begins creating a proxy force, the Contras.
The Contras, short for counterrevolutionaries. Who exactly were the United States recruiting to fight this covert war?
The CIA, initially utilizing veteran operatives from the brutal Argentine military dictatorship to handle the on-the-ground training, begins organizing, funding, and deeply arming a paramilitary army operating out of secret base camps across the northern border in Honduras. While the Contra ranks eventually swelled to include thousands of disgruntled peasant farmers who were angry over Sandinista agricultural policies or mandatory military conscription, the core leadership, the founding officer class of this new army, was drawn almost entirely from the exiled, deeply resentful remnants of Anastasio Somoza's defeated, brutal National Guard.
Which provides the Sandinistas with the most potent, undeniable propaganda imaginable. They don't even have to lie. They can simply broadcast to the peasantry the Americans are organizing Somoza's murderous thugs across the border, and they are sending them back to steal the land we just gave you.
It solidified Sandinista support among the rural poor initially. But the strategy behind the Contra War was not designed to achieve a conventional military victory. The CIA understood that the Contras, operating as light infantry guerrillas, could never defeat the heavily armed, Soviet-supplied Sandinista regular army in a set-piece battle. The strategy was far more insidious, drawn straight from covert operations manuals. It was a strategy of relentless economic warfare.
How does a proxy army execute macroeconomic warfare in the jungle?
By systematically obliterating the infrastructure necessary for the country to function. The CIA directed the Contras to avoid engaging the military and instead target the economic heart of the nation. They attacked and burned vital agricultural cooperatives. They blew up newly constructed power grids and telecommunications towers. They destroyed bridges and attacked civilian transport trucks. The objective was to paralyze the economy.
And the CIA itself engaged in direct, highly controversial actions to choke the economy.
Most infamously, in 1984, CIA operatives directly mined the harbor of Corento, Nicaragua's primary seaport. This reckless action damaged international civilian shipping vessels and triggered a massive global scandal, leading the World Court to condemn the United States for violating international law. Furthermore, the Reagan administration imposed a crushing, total economic embargo, completely cutting off Nicaragua from its largest historical trading partner and preventing them from accessing international financial markets.
The overarching goal isn't just to win a war, it's to induce suffering.
The explicit, documented goal of the campaign was to make the Nicaraguan economy scream. The brutal logic was attrition. If the U.S. inflicts enough sheer, grinding economic misery on the civilian population, the people will eventually become so exhausted and traumatized that they will turn against the Sandinista government, not out of ideological disagreement, but simply to make the unbearable pain of the war stop.
The pressure is unimaginable. The entire decade of the 1980s is consumed by this brutal proxy warfare. The Sandinistas are forced to divert the vast majority of their national budget away from the social programs, the clinics, and the schools, and pour it entirely into the military just to survive the onslaught. They institute a highly unpopular mandatory military draft to fight the Contras. By the end of the decade, the country is in total smoking ruins. The economy has hyperinflated into oblivion. Which leads us to our final act. We reach 1989, the nation is completely exhausted, and suddenly the massive global tectonic plates shift once again, fundamentally altering the rules of the game.
The Cold War, the overarching framework that defined the conflict, is rapidly coming to an end. The Soviet Union, which had been artificially propping up the collapsing Nicaraguan economy with vital shipments of oil and financial aid, is facing its own terminal economic crisis. Moscow sends a blunt message to the Sandinista leadership. The aid is stopping. You are on your own. Simultaneously in Washington, the Iran-Contra scandal and shifting domestic politics lead the U.S. Congress to permanently cut off military funding for the Contra paramilitaries.
So the superpower lifelines for both sides are suddenly severed.
Both the Sandinista government and the Contra army find themselves completely out of resources, out of money, and facing a mutually assured stalemate. The sheer exhaustion forces both sides to the negotiating table. To end the war and lift the crippling U.S. embargo, the Sandinistas agree to hold an early, internationally supervised national election in February 1990.
This election is the ultimate dramatic showdown. It is a referendum on the entire revolutionary project. You have Daniel Ortega, the incumbent president, running for the Sandinistas, and stepping up to run against him, leading the opposition, is Violeta Chamorro,
The widow of the martyred journalist, the woman who resigned from the Sandinista junta a decade earlier. She emerges as the unifying presidential candidate for a massive, sprawling opposition coalition known as UNO.
And UNO is a fascinating political entity because it isn't a cohesive party.
UNO was an incredibly fragile, contradictory alliance of 14 different political parties. It encompassed everyone from traditional wealthy conservatives and massive landowners to the Communist Party of Nicaragua to extreme right-wing factions. The coalition had absolutely no shared vision for governing the country. The only singular issue they agreed upon was that the Sandinista government had to be removed from power.
Despite this chaotic opposition, almost every international observer, pollster, and the Sandinistas themselves assume Daniel Ortega is going to win in a landslide. They control the machinery of the state. They are the mythic heroes who toppled the Somoza dictatorship. They brought literacy to the marginalized. They hold massive, jubilant campaign rallies with hundreds of thousands of supporters.
But the result of the ballot box delivers a shock that reverberates around the entire world. In a stunning upset, Violeta Chamorro wins the presidency with roughly 55% of the vote. The Sandinistas, the vanguard of the revolution, are democratically voted out of power.
This result forces us to examine the profound psychology of the electorate. Why did the very people who most benefited from the revolution, the peasants, the newly literate workers, the mothers, step into the voting booth and vote against the heroes who liberated them?
It was not a rejection of the revolution's ideals. It was a vote driven by absolute, profound exhaustion. When the average Nicaraguan entered the voting booth, they didn't necessarily hate the social justice goals of the Sandinistas, but they had to look at the brutal, unyielding reality of their daily lives. The economy was completely destroyed. Inflation was running at tens of thousands of %, rendering their money worthless. Supermarket shelves were empty. But most importantly, their sons were being continuously drafted into the army to fight and die in endless muddy battles against the Contras in the northern mountains.
They recognized the inescapable geopolitical trap they were caught in.
Exactly. The electorate understood the brutal calculus of the Cold War. They realized that as long as the FSLN remained in power, the United States, this massive, vindictive superpower to the north, would never ever stop punishing them. The embargo would never be lifted. The proxy war would never truly end. Voting for Violeta Chamorro was not necessarily a rejection of Sandino. It was a desperate, heartbreaking vote for peace. They voted to surrender simply because they wanted the empire to stop hitting them. They wanted their sons to come home.
So Violeta Chamorro achieves this miraculous victory. But the victory instantly morphs into an absolute nightmare of governance. She inherits a country that is completely broken.
She inherits a smoking ruin, and she immediately faces an impossible political paradox. The UNO coalition that elected her, those 14 disparate parties, immediately begins fracturing and turning on each other because they have absolutely nothing in common now that the Sandinistas have lost the presidency. She faces constant legislative gridlock and a rapidly disintegrating political base.
And she has to look at the terrifying mathematical reality of the state. The Sandinistas lost the presidency, but they still represent 40% of the electorate. They still control the massive labor unions. And crucially, the Sandinista People's Army is still the official military of the nation. The defeated party still holds all the guns. So how does she actually govern?
She executes one of the most astonishing, controversial political pivots in modern history, recognizing that her own right-wing UNO coalition is useless, and that trying to govern against the active resistance of the Sandinista military would trigger a new civil war. Chamorro largely abandons the very coalition that elected her. Instead, she forms a pragmatic, working political alliance with the Sandinistas.
She allies with the people she just spent an entire decade trying to defeat. She allows Daniel Ortega's brother, Humberto Ortega, to remain the head of the National Army. It is mind-boggling to the international community. But if we connect this grand political maneuver back to the intimate human element, Violeta Chamorro's own family dynamic serves as the perfect, heartbreaking metaphor for this entire conflict.
It truly is the defining metaphor of the Nicaraguan tragedy. Consider the reality of the Chamorro family dinners during the brutal proxy war of the 1980s. Violeta Chamorro had 4 children. 2 of her children worked alongside her at the opposition newspaper, La Prensa, actively fighting against the Sandinista regime, supporting the U.S. embargo. But her 2 other children were high-ranking, deeply committed officials within the Sandinista government itself, working directly for Daniel Ortega. Her own flesh and blood, raised in the same house, were leading the 2 fiercely opposing sides of a brutal, bloody civil war.
The war literally divided the dining room table. So when she assumes the presidency and forms a pragmatic alliance with the Sandinistas to govern the country, she is essentially forced to mirror on a national scale what had to happen in her own living room for the family to survive.
It is the ultimate Nicaraguan solution. In a country where the Civil War wasn't fought against strangers, but against cousins, neighbors, and brothers, there could be no clean, triumphant ideological victory. The society was too deeply intertwined. The only way the country could physically stop the bleeding and move forward was through a messy, painful, deeply compromised reconciliation with the enemy. They had to learn to govern alongside the people who had killed their relatives.
Wow, let's pull completely out of the basement and look at the entire structure we've examined today. To summarize this incredible violent arc, we started by analyzing a peripheral colonial outpost struggling to survive the collapse of the plant dye market. We watched a desperate political faction hire an American mercenary who attempted to enslave the population, leaving a permanent, justified scar of anti-American paranoia across the culture.
We saw that paranoia fully realized as Wall Street bankers and U.S. Marines engineered a subservient government purely to protect corporate profit, inadvertently radicalizing a mechanic named Sandino and giving birth to a mythic nationalist martyr.
We watched the U.S. install the Somoza family, who spent 4 decades turning a sovereign nation into a mafia-run piggy bank, pushing the population so far into the dirt, literally extorting them over bus fares in the ruins of an earthquake, that a radical Marxist revolution became the only logical, necessary escape hatch for the middle class.
Only for the victorious revolutionaries to find that escaping a brutal dictator meant steering directly into the crosshairs of a Cold War superpower.
Ew.
This led to a decade of devastating economic strangulation and proxy warfare. The revolution ultimately succeeded in asserting Nicaraguan nationalism and permanently breaking the Somoza dynasty, but the dream of building a prosperous, equitable society was ground to dust by the unyielding reality of geopolitical conflict.
It brings us back to the core lesson of this entire deep dive. Revolutions are rarely simple, cinematic stories of pure good versus absolute evil. They aren't clean breaks from the past, they are generational pressure cookers. And history shows us that sometimes the violent cure necessary to kill the disease brings its own terrible, lasting suffering.
And that leaves us with a profound, lingering question to consider as we conclude. Think about the immense psychological toll inflicted on a nation where, simply to survive and rebuild, you must eventually sit down and form a working alliance with the very people who killed your family members or destroyed your livelihood. When global superpowers treat a small, vulnerable nation merely as a disposable square on a geopolitical chessboard, what happens to the mental health and the fundamental soul of the pawns once the grand game is finally over, the board is put away, and the players go home?
You look closely at the crack in the wall of the house, and you finally understand the sheer violence of the fault line shifting beneath it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.